Good evening. How's everybody doing on a Sunday, Yom Rishon? Great to be learning with you. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Sunday? Bill in mid-Missouri, Joe in the Inland Empire, Lucy in Minnesota, Paula is here, David in South Bend, Bella in Florida, Melissa in Great Neck, Ella in the house, Marjorie in from Virginia. Welcome everybody. Tom says Shavua Tov, Melissa in Great Neck. So good to have you all. Got a great page today. Our daf is Nun Beis, page 52 here in Tractate Gittin, the 19th volume of the Talmud. Continuing our discussion of rabbinic enactments that the sages created for the betterment of the world. And what's great about them is that they were so practical, right? Here, very often, we're dealing not in the theoretical at all, not in the hypothetical, but actual, purchase and sale, land, property, movable assets, inheritance. How are these things handled to protect, particularly those who cannot protect themselves? We see how often the sages they don't stretch the law, but they find an interpretation that is well within the law, and this was exactly the process that God initiated when he gave the oral tradition at Mount Sinai. It commenced there with laws that were given to Moses orally, and a system for applying the written laws of the Torah to novel situations that would come up over the course of history. And that's why we look to our elders in every generation to make rulings, halachic, Jewish legal rulings, on how to manage our affairs in a righteous and godly way. I'm going to mention, Nina and I saw Sound of Freedom today. You might have heard about this movie. You might well not have heard about this movie because it's got very little publicity, but it is, by word of mouth, really spreading. It's a thriller based on the true story of an agent working for Homeland Security, investigating child sex crimes, people trading in child pornography in America. But it exposed him to the horrors of this, and he felt like, okay, arresting the people with, this material on their hard drives doesn't really help the child, in only a very indirect way. And then he went and rescued some of these children. And this movie really tells, the true story of how he got involved in that and how he sought to rescue some particular children from a really horrific fate. Now, if you've heard that this movie is political in nature and that it aligns with one side or the other in the divisive politics of our country, you've been sold a bill of goods. This is a good movie, an entertaining movie, a very well-made movie that is elevated by the fact that it addresses a terrible evil that is going on in society. I don't care where these people come from, where they get, their resources, money, ability, whatever. Anybody who's engaged in that evil of exploiting children to fulfill their carnal lust, it's so undescribably evil that anybody, who shuts their eyes to it, you have to wonder where they're coming from. So if you hear that this movie's boring, I think I can judge entertainment. We make movies. I can tell you, this is not a boring movie. If you hear that it is political, I'm telling you it's not political. If you hear that it's religious, it's being termed a religious thriller, I would say that the main character identifies the people, perpetrating these crimes as evil, and that he feels like, in the world that he lives in and imagining it happening to his children, and if he's in a position to do something about it, then he's called to do it. That speech is longer than any speech he made about it in the movie. I mean, he feels called, but in no other way is this a religious movie. It's just very much a procedural thriller about an investigation, rescue operations, fighting bad guys. well-armed, truly wicked, dangerous bad guys. So, you don't normally hear me plug movies in our Talmud class, but I was really moved by that movie. I hope that everyone in America sees it, and that awareness is just the beginning, and that we do something about it. Because if the stat is true, and I believe it is, there are more people enslaved. I mean, we always talk about, Jewish laws of slavery. Well, so we understand how this was conducted when there was slavery in the ancient world 2,000 years ago. Jews, do not own slaves. But the fact is, there is slavery in the world today, and more people are in slavery today than ever before. The number of slaves in the world is higher now than it ever was in history. And a huge and terrifyingly, disgustingly large number of those people are children. So, I don't know what the answer is. I don't know how we rescue them, but anything we can do, we got to do it. You can start by seeing the movie. It's an easy enough thing to do. And it's a good movie, and it deserves your dollar. Your $10, your $15. It's money well spent to support movies like this. That's what I'll say for today. All right. Page 52 here in Tractate Gittin. We are in chapter 5, and today we're discussing Mishnah number 2. With regard to orphans who are living with a homeowner who takes care of all their needs and affairs, even if neither their father nor the court officially appointed the homeowner to this task, or if their father appointed a steward for them, the person is obligated to tithe their produce. A very interesting ruling. What is this about? Right, we are obligated to tithe our produce, right? So if you're living in ancient Israel, the temple is standing, you own a farm, you own fields, you grow produce on that. As we discussed many times, before that produce can be eaten, the first 2% goes to a priest, the next 10% goes to a Levite, the next 10% after that goes either for you to fund your pilgrimage to Jerusalem, or in 2 of the 7 years of the Shemitah cycle, it goes to the poor. And prior to tithing produce grown in the land of Israel, when the temple is standing, that produce cannot be eaten. Untithed produce is a transgression, a sin for a Jew to eat. So, if a steward, a caretaker, a ward of the, an agent of the court, right? The wards are the children. They are the wards of the, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm forgetting the word, but the caretaker appointed by the court. Their guardian, right? The guardian. So the guardian has to make sure that the children, if they're going to eat that produce, that it is tithed produce. But what if they're going to sell the produce, or they're going to store the produce? Those are 2 different questions. If they're going to store the produce, it's a problem, because this guardian maybe if he's appointed by the court, okay, he definitely has a legal relationship. If he's appointed by the father, he's the father's agent. But if it just falls to him to take care of these orphans, then maybe he doesn't have the agency that he needs in order to tithe. We tithe for our own produce. We're supposed to tithe ourselves. We can appoint an agent to do it for us. But is this guardian, especially if he's unappointed, going to qualify as an agent who can tithe the produce of the orphans? We'll discuss that. Now, with regard to a steward who was appointed by the orphan's father, when he returns all of the property to the orphans upon their reaching adulthood, he takes an oath that he took nothing of theirs for himself. By contrast, if the court appointed him to serve as a steward for them, then he is not required to take such an oath. Sorry. LAPD passing overhead. There we go. Abba Shaul says, no. You've got it backwards. A steward appointed by the court takes an oath that he didn't keep any of the orphan's property for himself while he was their guardian, but a steward appointed by the orphan's father is not required to take such an oath. Now remember, with this law of oaths, just like the one who finds a lost object, when he returns it, he's not obligated to take an oath that he kept some of it for himself, right? The law of whether you have to take an oath or not is not the law of may you take something for yourself or not, right? You may not. You cannot use anything of yourself, of the orphans for yourself, except for, what is going to be reasonable expenses of administrating the estate for them. The question is whether we ask somebody to take an oath, and as always, there's going to be policy considerations. In other words, if we make people take an oath in order to protect the orphans from them keeping anything from them for themselves, are we going to discourage people from assuming the role of a guardian of these orphans? Okay, that's the Mishnah. Here comes the Gemara. The Mishnah teaches, and by the way, the halacha is, as Abba Shaul says, right, that a steward appointed by the court does have to take the oath that during the years of acting as a guardian, he didn't keep anything for himself. But a steward appointed by the father of the orphans before the father died is not required to take that oath. That's where the law came out. Okay, now the Gemara on this Mishnah. The Mishnah teaches that a steward is obligated to tithe the produce of the orphans in his charge. The Gemara raises a contradiction from a Baraisa that expounds a verse dealing with the teruma of the tithe given by a Levite to a priest. Thus, you shall offer a gift to the Lord. Numbers 18:28. And the emphasis placed on the word you teaches as follows: you separate teruma, the tithe for the priest, but not partners, meaning that one partner may not separate teruma on behalf of the other. You separate teruma, but not sharecroppers. You, the owner of the field, separate teruma, but not stewards. And you separate teruma, but not one who separates teruma from produce that is not his. How then can the Mishnah say that a steward is able to and even required to tithe the produce of the orphans in his charge when that produce does not belong to him? And Rav Chisda said that this is not difficult. La kasha. Here the Mishnah is dealing with a steward who tithes the orphans' produce in order to feed it to them. Since he is not permitted to feed them untithed produce, the sages allowed him to tithe that which he gives them to eat. There, the Baraisa is referring to produce that is not needed for the orphan's sustenance. Rather, the steward wishes to put it aside in a tithed state. Since he is not the owner of the produce, he lacks the authority to tithe it under those circumstances. And it is taught in a Baraisa Tosefta, Terumas 110, that this distinction is made based on whether the steward intends to feed the produce to the orphans or store it. Stewards can separate teruma and tithes from the produce of the orphans in their charge in order to feed the produce to them so that they won't be eating untithed produce, but not with the intention to put the produce aside, right, in the silo, right? And stewards may sell the orphans' possessions for them as follows: cattle, male and female slaves, houses, fields, and vineyards in order to feed the orphans so that they will have something to eat immediately, but not with the intention to put aside the proceeds for future use, right? So if the estate that they inherit from the father, in which because they're too young, they're unable to administer for themselves, so a guardian is appointed to watch their affairs for them, either by their father or by the court. So he can tithe for them, and he can even sell some of their property, but only to fund their immediate needs, not because the steward thinks that he's protecting their investment. It's very interesting. Like, you might think, if you think about some area of the country where for some reason property values are plummeting, I don't know where, some city in America where things are not going well and property values are plummeting. And let's say that the estate, maybe the primary asset in the estate was a house or an apartment building or something, in that city. So the steward might think to himself, I got to protect these kids. I should sell that piece of land now, even though the price is dropping, but it's going to go even lower, and reinvest it somewhere where the market is going up. That would be a smart investment. Is he allowed to do that? No. Only for the immediate needs. Why is he not allowed to do that? Well, the status quo is the kids inherited an estate from their father. If the guardian goes in with the best intentions in the world, but he makes a mistake, he reads the market wrong, and the investment ends up being worth even less, then what is he going to tell the kids? He tried to, be smarter than their dad was, and he lost their money. So the sages say, no, you only sell for their immediate needs. Otherwise, your job is to maintain the estate as is and hand it to the kids when they're old enough. And they may also sell produce, wine, oil, and flour for them in order to feed them, but not with the intention to put aside the proceeds for a later date. Now, I would assume that does not mean that if they own fields, where like you harvest the crop, and then if you don't sell it or store it, maybe even if you store it, it's going to rot and you're going to lose it all. So in that case, it would be better to sell it. I mean, if the choices are for sure lose it or sell it, then I'm sure you're allowed to turn it into cash rather than face a total loss. But let's just read the halacha. Right, a steward may sell the orphan's animals, male and female slaves, fields, vineyards, in order to feed them with the proceeds, but he may not execute such a sale in order to put the money aside. The Rima writes, citing the Tur, that in general, he should sell animals before slaves and slaves before houses, and the actual order of sale depends on what the steward deems best for the orphans. But again, that's for their upkeep, to feed them now, not as an investment decision. Now the Baraisa continues, and stewards make the following items that are required for the fulfillment of a mitzvah, of commandments for the orphans. From their property, right? A steward has the authority to make a lulav that we use, the branch that we hold, that we use on the holiday of Sukkot, or some say Sukkot. A willow branch, the sukkah itself, the tzitzis, right? The ritual fringes on our garments, and any item used for a mitzvah that involves a fixed expense. And the Gemara notes that the words, any item used for a mitzvah, serve to include a shofar, and they may purchase a Torah scroll for the orphans, and tefillin, and mezuzah, and any other item used for a mitzvah that involves a fixed expense. And the Gemara comments that these also include a Megillah that is read, the scroll of Esther that is read on Purim. The Brisa continues, but stewards may not undertake to give charity on behalf of orphans. Interesting. And they may not redeem captives on their behalf. Even though giving charity and redeeming captives is a mitzvah, you're not allowed to do that mitzvah on behalf of the orphans. Nor may they do anything with the orphan's property that does not involve a fixed expense. The Gemara explains that this last phrase serves to include that which is brought to comfort mourners. A steward may not use property belonging to the orphans in his charge for this purpose. The Baraisa continues, and stewards are not permitted to involve themselves in litigation if the purpose is to accept an obligation or to secure gain for the property of the orphans. And the Gemara asks, why may they not enter into litigation to secure gain? If the steward can see that somebody has damaged the orphans and the only way to get those damages into the estate is through litigation, why would we not want them to enter into that litigation? And the Gemara clarifies, rather, this means that stewards are not permitted to involve themselves in litigation in which they will accept financial obligation upon the orphan's estate, even if they do so in order to ultimately secure gain for the property of the orphan. Meaning, anytime you get yourself involved in plaintiff's litigation, right, you're going to hire a lawyer to go sue somebody. Maybe you'll win. Maybe your cause is very just. Maybe the likelihood of winning is very high. Is it guaranteed? No. Is it expensive to hire lawyers? Right, and the Baraisa continues, and stewards are not permitted to sell a field belonging to the orphans that is located in a distant place and use the proceeds to redeem a field that their father had sold in a nearby place. Although this is ordinarily considered to be a favorable exchange, And similarly, stewards are not permitted to sell a bad field and use the proceeds to redeem a good one. And the Gemara explains, what is the reason for this? The reason is that perhaps the fields that the steward purchases will become blighted, right? They will rot, so they will get some kind of a fungus or, some kind of wheat disease that kills all the produce and ruins the land. And it will turn out that the steward has caused the orphans a loss with his purchase. Despite the best intentions, he could get it wrong. Better he should just sit on it in the most conservative investment possible. No risk, right? That's what they want from the steward. No risk. Now the Brisa continues, and stewards are not permitted to sell fields belonging to the orphans and use the proceeds to purchase slaves. But they may sell the orphans slaves and use their proceeds to purchase fields, as land is considered to be a more stable asset, right? That is considered in all cases less risky, right? That a slave could die at any time, land is not going anywhere, so if you can turn slaves into land, better for the orphans. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says stewards may not even sell slaves and use the proceeds to purchase fields, and that actually is the law, right? So you might think that even though land is such a more stable asset than slaves, that they could do that. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says they can't, and the law follows Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel in this, even against the majority who disputed with him. And what is the reason for this? Perhaps it will turn out that the property is not secure. The ownership of the fields is contested by others, and consequently the steward will have made matters more complicated for the orphans as a result of his exchange of turning slaves into real property. Now the Brisa continues, and stewards are not permitted to free slaves belonging to the orphans in their charge, even if it is necessary to do so for any reason, but they may sell them to others, and then those others may free the slaves. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says, I say that even he, the slave himself, may give his own monetary value to the steward, and thereby go free, due to the fact that it is as if the steward sold the slave to the slave himself. It is irrelevant whether it is some other person or the slave himself who pays his purchase price. And the steward must calculate with the orphans in the end. When they reach adulthood and he hands over the property to them, at that time he has to do an accounting. And he calculates of all the expenses and income generated by the property during the period that he served as steward. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says he is not required to do so, as the court relies on his integrity. The court does not appoint women, slaves, or minors as stewards, but if the father of the orphans appointed a woman, a minor, or a slave as the orphan's steward, he has permission to do so. It is related that there was a certain steward who was in Rabbi Meir's neighborhood, who was selling land belonging to the orphans and purchasing slaves with the proceeds. And Rabbi Meir did not allow him to do this, right? It makes sense. You can't turn land into slaves. Definitely, you can't even turn slaves into land, which would seem like a better investment. So certainly you can't turn land into slaves, but Rabbi Meir did not allow him to do this because the practice is contrary to halacha. Then listen to what happened next. So Rabbi Meir said to the steward, look, I know you can give me every argument in the world why financially it makes more sense to sell this problematic real property and reinvest that money in slaves, which maybe right now is a good market for that, 2,000 years ago in the ancient world. And you can make a good argument that this is what's best for the orphans. But I'm telling you, Rabbi Meir, I'm telling you that is against halacha and you cannot do that. That night, Rabbi Meir has a dream. They showed him in his dream. Who's they? Meaning, the angels who have impact. They don't run our dreams, but they have impact on our dreams, right? So they showed him in his dream the words, I wish to destroy and you build. Who's speaking? That's God. So Rabbi Meir has a dream where words are shown to him attributed to God. That in this situation, God wishes to destroy, right? And that's why the steward was going to do that. And Rabbi Meir thinks he knows better. He wishes to build. So Rabbi Meir understood this dream as a sign that God wanted the orphans to suffer financial collapse, and somehow that was going to be better for them. and therefore it would be preferable to allow the steward to continue his practice. Even so, Rabbi Meir paid no heed to his dream and said, words appearing in dreams do not bring up and do not take down, and they should not be taken into consideration. Right? So if you get a message in a dream that tells you to do something that violates Jewish law, halacha, you don't listen to the dream. Rabbi Meir had such a dream, a powerful dream. He woke up shaking. He was sure this was a message from God. But what was the source of the message? A dream. And in that dream, the message told him to do something that violates halacha. He said, no, I don't listen to that dream. Is that to say that we never listen to dreams? No, we learned in Tractate Brachos that if you have a dream and you don't think about what it means, a dream uninterpreted is like a letter not answered. So we are tasked with thinking about what do our dreams mean. And basically, according to the interpretation, so is the dream. Like what we figure, what comes to us as the meaning of the dream, generally is the meaning of the dream. And if we can't figure it out, we're tasked to go and ask some people that we think could give us good advice about what the dream might mean. Do we act on it? Maybe. You got to think about it. If the dream violates halacha, no, we don't act on that dream. But if it actually, points out a path for us where we think actually we will rise in holiness, we will do a righteous thing, well, then that is a dream that we would act on. Apropos, an incident involving Rabbi Meir that we just learned, the Gemara relates another story about Rabbi Meir. It has nothing to do with the subject we've been discussing. It's just a story about Rabbi Meir. But check this out. There were two people who, incited by Satan, would argue with each other every Friday afternoon at twilight, meaning right before Shabbos started. Rabbi Meir happened to come to the place where they argued. He stopped them from fighting 3 Friday afternoons at twilight. In other words, he stopped them from going into Shabbos in the middle of an argument. Until, finally, he made peace between these two people. Having stopped those arguments 3 weeks in a row, they actually stopped arguing altogether. They made peace. And Rabbi Meir then heard Satan say, woe that Rabbi Meir removed that man, meaning Satan himself, from this house. And this indicates that Satan himself lives among those who live in discord. A house of quarrels is a house of quarrels, I just made this up tonight. A house of quarrels is a home for Satan, right? That's the title of our show. So I just paraphrase what's here, but it's a good thing to remember, right? A house of quarrels is a home for Satan. Now, worth mentioning, as I always do when Satan comes up in the Talmud, that the understanding in Jewish tradition of who Satan is a little bit different than what sort of popular culture would say. Satan is not some kind of demon that fell and runs his own empire at war with God. That's not the Jewish understanding of Satan. Satan is the adversary, meaning he's the prosecutor, right? So there's the heavenly court, and Satan is the one who brings charges against the humans. In order to bring effective charges, he will conduct the same kind of behavior that's often ascribed to him in popular culture, right? He tempts people. He tempts people to behave in sinful ways so that he can then go running to God and say, see, look at your creatures, look at your people, look at your children, look how wicked they are, look how base they are, look how enslaved they are by their own inclinations. And then, we pray there's going to be some advocate up there arguing on our behalf. One of the great advocates in Jewish history was Levi Yitzhak of Berditchev. Well before him, and perhaps the greatest advocate of all time, as we've been reading about week after week in the Parsha these days, is Moses, who argues on our behalf, right? When the children of Israel were just, time and time again, saying and doing awful things in the wilderness, and God wanted to just wipe everybody out. And Moses would argue, no, God, you got to understand, they're humans, they're subject to temptations, they err, they stray, they make mistakes. Satan tempts them. Right? Please keep exercising your patience and let your mercy be stronger than your justice, right? But that's the understanding of Satan. But as I said, the behavior is effectively almost the same, right? Satan tempts us to behave in ways that drive us apart, that lead us to sin, and that diminish our levels of sanctity and righteousness. And it's worth noting, right, that a house in which people are constantly fighting is a house in which people will end up sinning, right? That's what we're being taught here. It is related that there was a certain steward of orphans who was in the neighborhood of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, who was selling land and buying oxen on behalf of the orphans. Selling land and buying animals, that sounds like a terrible trade. But he was doing this on behalf of the orphans. And Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi did not say anything to the steward to the effect that he was acting improperly. Why would Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi not tell this steward that it's against halacha to sell land in order to purchase oxen? And the Gemara explains that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei. As it is taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Yosei said, in all my days I did not call my wife, nor my ox. Rather, I refer to my wife as my home, because she is the essence of my home. Right? Understand that Rabbi Yosei is paying his wife the ultimate compliment. Right? She's not just a woman. She's not just his partner. She's his existence. And she defines the existence of the two of them as a couple. So he refers to her as his home. Why does he not call an ox an ox, right? What does he call an ox? He calls an ox a field. What does this mean? Rather, I called my wife my home because she's the essence of my home, and I called my ox my field because the primary force behind enhancements to the field is the ox that plows it. And similarly, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi maintains that purchasing oxen to work the land is considered like purchasing land itself, and that consequently a protest should not be raised against the steward who sold some of the land belonging to the orphans in order to purchase oxen with which he could work the rest of the land. It is further related that certain orphans who lived with an old woman had an ox, and she took it and sold it on their behalf. Relatives of those orphans came before Rav Nachman and said to him, what is she doing, selling the orphans' property? Who authorized her to do so? Rav Nachman said to them, we learn from the phrase in the Mishna, if orphans are living with a homeowner, the official appointment as a steward is not necessary. The fact that the orphans lived with the woman and she took care of them sufficed to bestow upon her the authority of a steward. You might ask these relatives, hey, you care so much about the orphans, why aren't they living with you? Instead, they're living with this woman who's not their relative and you're criticizing her from afar? The relatives continued with their objection to the sale, but didn't the animal afterward increase in value, which is reason to invalidate the transaction? She sold it too cheaply. Rav Nachman answered, the animal increased in value while in the possession of the buyer, and this is not considered a loss suffered by the orphans. The relatives said to him, but they did not yet receive the money, and consequently the sale was not yet complete. Rav Nachman said to them, if this is so, this is what Rav Hanalai bar Idi says, that Shmuel says. As Rav Hanalai bar Idi says, that Shmuel says, orphans' property is like consecrated property, and is fully acquired only with the transfer of money. Since they did not yet receive the money, they can raise the purchase price or renege on the entire sale, as opposed to a purchase and sale of a movable object or even for land, right? That is not in the case of orphans, where we see that the money changing hands is not actually the act of acquisition, the kinyan, as we've been talking about for several days. That act of acquisition is when the buyer formally takes possession of the item that is being purchased. So if an ox is being sold, then when the one who buys it pulls the ox toward him, literally pulls it so that it moves, and you do this in front of witnesses, and now there's been a formal act of acquisition, and the purchaser has purchased the ox, and it is now his ox. Even if the money hasn't changed hands yet, the money is now owed. It is a liability. The purchase cannot be reversed. But when we're talking about orphans, the same law is going to apply to them that applies to the temple treasury, namely the extra protection for the treasury and for the temple treasury and for orphans, that the sale, they could pull out of the sale even after the act of acquisition has been done. But if the money has not yet been received, the orphans could unwind the sale. Right, so similarly, it is related that those who came to buy the wine of Rabbana Ukva, the orphan, pulled it into their possession after having agreed on a purchase price of 44 dinars per barrel. But after the buyers actually paid for the wine, it increased in value, and its price stood at 66 dinars per barrel. The parties came before Rav Nachman for a ruling on the matter. He said to them, this is subject to that which Rav Hanilai bar Idi said. As Rav Hanilai bar Idi says, that Shmuel says, orphan's property is like consecrated property and is fully acquired only with the transfer of money. Consequently, the buyers pay the current higher price or the sale can be rendered void. Now, the Gemara records several additional laws relating to this topic. If the buyers pulled into their possession produce belonging to orphans but did not yet pay for it, and afterward the produce increased in value, this is subject to what Rav Hanilai bar Idi said. Orphan's property is acquired only with the transfer of money, and until payment is made, the transaction can still be rendered void. But if the produce decreased in value and the buyers wish to renege on the sale, so one can argue, just as it is said that the power of an ordinary person should not be greater than that of the temple treasury, so too the power of orphans should not be less than that of other people, since the buyers pulled the orphan's property into their possession, thereby performing an act of acquisition. The sale is valid and the buyers cannot retract. If the steward pulled produce into his possession on behalf of the orphans but did not yet pay for it, and afterward it increased in value, then just as the power of an ordinary person should not be greater than that of the temple treasury, so too the power of the orphans should not be less than that of other people. Therefore the orphans acquired the produce based on its price at the time the steward pulled it into their possession. But if the produce decreased in value and now the steward wishes to cancel the sale, the students in the study hall understood from here that this is included in what Rav Hanilai bar Idi said, that transactions involving orphans are completed only with the transfer of money, and therefore the steward can renege on the sale and acquire the produce at the lower price. Do you see the theme? The orphans are always protected. If market change before the deal was completed, if it favors the orphans to pull out of the sale, they can pull out of the sale. If it favors the orphans that the other side cannot pull out of the sale, then the other side cannot pull out of the sale. It is not even, right? It is not even. The orphans enjoy a financial advantage in transactions with them because the law protects those who cannot protect themselves. Rav Shesha, the son of Rav Idi, said to them, this would be bad for the orphans were they treated in this unequal manner, as they might at times need produce and nobody will give it to them before they actually pay the money. It is preferable for them to be treated like other buyers who finalize their acquisition when they pull the produce into their possession. If the orphans gave money for the purchase of produce but did not yet physically transfer it into their possession and afterward the produce decreased in value, then one applies the principle that the power of an ordinary person, the seller, should not be greater than the temple treasury. Therefore, the orphans can renege on the purchase as an act of acquisition has not yet been performed. But if the produce increased in value and the orphans wish to uphold the sale, the students in the study hall remembered Rav Hanilai bar Idi's ruling that again the orphans have an advantage. Rav Shesha, the son of Rav Idi, said to them, this would be bad for the orphans. And were they treated this way, now we're in 52b, as the sellers will come to say to them, your wheat was burned in the upper story of my house and you have lost everything. If a fire breaks out, the sellers will not attempt to save the produce because they already received payment for it and now it belongs to the orphans. Right? In other words, there's going to be unintended consequences. You want to protect those who can't protect themselves. But if you make those protections overbroad, you're actually going to make it impossible for those orphans to find buyers for their goods, or to find sellers for what they need, or to lend the estate money when they need to lend, or right when they need to borrow. If you make the protections too strong, you end up hurting them. If buyers gave the orphans money for the purchase of produce, but did not yet physically transfer it into their possession. Wait, did I just read that? Yeah. If buyers gave the orphans money for the purchase of produce, but did not yet physically transfer it into their possession, and afterwards the produce increased in value, then one applies the principle that the power of an ordinary person should not be greater than the temple treasury, and therefore the orphans can renege on the sale as a valid act of acquisition has not yet been performed, and if the produce decreased in value and the orphans wish to uphold the sale, the students understood that we apply Rav Hanalai bar Edi's ruling, and again, Rav Shesha, the son of Rav Edi, said to them, this would be bad for the orphans, were they treated in this way, as there may be times that the orphans need money and no one will give it to them before they actually give them the produce, and consequently it is preferable for them to be treated like other sellers who finalize their sales only once the merchandise is pulled by the buyers. We protect the orphans, but we understand that there can be unintended consequences. Rav Ashi said, Rav Kahana and I signed the deed of sale for the mother of Zerah, the orphan, who, as the child's steward, sold land without first making a public announcement in order to pay the head tax. It was permitted for her to act in this manner due to what the sages of Nehardea said. When an orphan's property is sold, a public announcement of the sale must be made first in order to ensure that the seller will receive the highest price. But when the property is sold to raise money for the payment of the head tax, or to provide for sustenance for the orphans, or to pay for the burial of their parent who died, the money is needed immediately. So the property may be sold even without a public announcement. And the Gemara relates, Amram the dyer was a steward for orphans, and the orphans' relatives came before Rav Nachman and said to him, he dresses and covers himself with clothing purchased from the property of the orphans. Rav Nachman said to them, perhaps he does this in order that his words would be heard, meaning that he dresses himself in finer clothes than he could ordinarily afford in order to better manage the property of the orphans, as he will be ignored if he appears to be a poor person. They said to him, he eats and drinks lavishly from the orphan's property and is not known to be rich enough to be able to afford such large expenditures from his own money. Rav Nachman said to them, say perhaps that he found the lost item, with the help of which he can allow himself to maintain a higher standard of living. They said to him, but he is damaging the orphan's property and thereby causing them financial loss. Rav Nachman said to them, bring me witnesses that he is damaging their property, and I will remove him from the stewardship. As our colleague Rav Huna said in the name of Rav, that in the case of a steward who damages the property of the orphans, the court removes him. As it was stated with regard to a steward who damages orphans' property, Rav Huna says that Rav says the court removes him. In the school of Rabbi Shela, they say the court does not remove him. The Gemara concludes that the halacha is that the court removes him. So, if it's clear, if the witnesses come, if there's evidence brought that the steward is damaging the estate, the property of the orphans, the court removes him. But if he's, just paying himself what seems like a reasonable wage, and sort of like, enabling him to do business on behalf of the orphans better, this is a person who's taken it upon himself to manage the affairs of children who are not his own, for them, for their sake. This is a person of high moral repute, and we shouldn't impute bad motivations, bad actions. We shouldn't believe that he's a criminal or ripping off the orphans in the absence of clear evidence of that. So Rav Nachman was not going to be so quick to assume, just because somebody came and whispered in his ear, that these people were doing something wrong. When they kept saying, he's doing something wrong, he's doing something wrong, he's doing something wrong, he said, okay, bring me evidence. I don't know if they brought evidence. The story, the Gemara moves on. The Mishnah teaches, with regard to a steward who was appointed by the orphan's father, right? Not by the court, but by the father. when the steward returns all the property to the orphans upon their reaching adulthood, the steward takes an oath that he took nothing of theirs for himself. And the Gemara explains, what is the reason for this? If the steward had not received some benefit from the father during his life, he would not have agreed to become a steward for his children. And he will not come to avoid becoming a steward merely because of an oath that the court will impose upon him sometime in the future. I'm approaching the end of today's daf, so if you have questions or comments, please get them in. The Mishnah then teaches, by contrast, if the court appointed him rather than the father appointed him, if the court appointed him to serve as a steward for the orphans, then he is not required to take such an oath. And the Gemara explains the reason for this is that it is merely a favor that the steward does for the court, as he derives no benefit from accepting the position. And if you also cast an obligation upon him to take an oath, he will come to avoid becoming a steward, and the orphans will suffer a loss, as people will not be willing to administer their affairs, because people don't want to take oaths. They don't want to take oaths because even though you might, with full honesty, say, I never took anything from those kids, and I'll swear in any court on, any Bible, you might have made a mistake. And by mistake, you took some of their property and you weren't aware that you did it. But then you swore a false oath, which is a big sin. So people would rather not swear oaths. And if becoming a steward also involves swearing an oath, people are going to be very reticent to do it. Now, the Mishnah then teaches, Abba Shaul says, no, you got the cases wrong. Even at the level of the Mishnah, Abba Shaul is quoted as saying, no, you've got the cases reversed. And the law is, like Abba Shaul says, that the cases are reversed. It is not a steward appointed by the orphan's father who has to take an oath, but rather the steward who is appointed by the court who must take the oath. And the Gemara clarifies Abba Shaul's opinion. What is the reason that if the court appointed the steward, he must take an oath that he didn't take any property belonging to the orphans when he finishes his stewardship? What is the reason for this? Since this person derives a certain benefit from being appointed as a steward of the orphans, in that publicity is generated about him that he is a trustworthy man, right? If he is trusted by the court to be the steward of the orphans, other people in the community will come to understand that this is a person of a high character, high moral integrity, and they're going to be much quicker to do business with him. So he benefits. Right? So that publicity is generated about him that he is a trustworthy man, as is demonstrated by the fact that the court relies upon him and appoints him to the position of responsibility. Therefore, he will not come to avoid becoming a steward merely because of an oath that the court will impose upon him. Right? In both cases, we'd rather that the person who is the steward takes the oath just to protect the orphans. The question is, why would we exempt the person from taking an oath? And that would be because we're afraid that if we don't exempt them, less people will step forward to do the job. But since one appointed by the court benefits from that stewardship and that his character is burnished in the eyes of the community, people won't be reluctant to take that position. By contrast, if the orphan's father appointed him as steward, he is not required to take an oath. And why is this so? It is merely a favor that these people do for each other. And if you cast an additional obligation upon the steward to take an oath, he will come to avoid accepting the position, and the orphans will suffer a loss, as people will not be willing to administer their affairs. Rav Chanan Bar Ami says that Shmuel says the law is in accordance with the opinion of Abba Shaul, and that is so. It is taught in Baraisa that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says both this one, the steward appointed by the father, and that one, the court-appointed steward, take an oath, and the law is in accordance with this statement, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov was wrong. The law does not accord with that statement. Rav Tachlifa from the west, meaning from the land of Israel, as opposed to the Jewish community in Babylonia, taught a Baraisa before Rabbi Abahu. In the case of a steward who is appointed to that position by the father of the orphans, he takes an oath when the orphans reach adulthood. And he returns the property to them because he receives payment, i.e. he derives a certain benefit from managing the orphan's property. Rabbi Abahu said to him, did you bring a kav and measure how much the steward earns for his efforts? Rather say that he takes an oath because it is as if he received payment. Presumably agreed to serve as the orphan's steward because of a benefit that he derived from their father during his lifetime. And consequently, it is as if he received payment for accepting the stewardship. But at any rate, the law is that the one appointed by the father does not take an oath, and the one appointed by the court does. That's what I've got for us today. Let's check comments and questions. Bill, is it possible for a father to grant the steward greater agency? I'm thinking of American trust law, where the manager of a trust fund may have the same limit that the DAF is talking about, where they cannot alter the estate to the extent that they can, or they can have the fiduciary obligation to attempt to invest the estate well. I think what you're asking is, can the father leave instructions, some kind of a stipulation in a document of agency that empowers this steward to more actively manage the affairs, meaning sell land and turn it into oxen or slaves if that's going to be a better investment, sell land that's far away in order to buy land close by, etc., because the father had real reason to trust this person. And I don't know the answer. It's a great question. What if the captive is one of the orphans or one of the orphan's parents? Can the stewards then redeem the captive? Wow, what a great question. Right, we said that the steward is empowered to spend money in order for the orphans to perform mitzvahs that they must perform, like wrapping tefillin, like praying, like reading from the Torah. But there are other mitzvahs, like giving charity or redeeming captives, that don't necessarily come up every day and that wouldn't be appropriate for the steward to do on behalf of the orphans. But if the orphan himself is the captive, I can't imagine any ruling that would say that the steward cannot use that money to redeem the orphan. It just defies common sense. And my father, who's not a very religious man, but was studied a little bit of Talmud with his rabbi, says to me, Sal, from what I've seen, the Talmud does not defy common sense. So, I don't know that that's always true, but I'm pretty sure it's true in this case. And Joseph, were stewards typically family members or from the same tribe area or a hired hand from anywhere? I have no idea. I would think that it's going to be the person who's best suited for the job in the particular situation. Maybe the orphans were deprived of their parents suddenly and they don't have other relatives. That's where the court is going to have to step in and appoint somebody who is both appropriate and willing, right? It's not going to be such a simple thing. I don't know. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Monday at the regular Monday time, the regular weekday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.